Hybrid by L.A.Lewis. I have known Billy Cole, or to give him his proper title, Dr. X. W. Cole, M.D., M.R.C.S., since we were at school together. The X stands for Xavier, a tradition in his family, but of course no one could be bothered with a mouthful like that. He is, both in character and appearance, what one generally refers to as a hard case. All doctors have to be, owing to their familiarity with pain and disease and the tragedy of their causes. But Billy is an exception even among his fraternity, because most of his professional career has been spent in the capacity of a ship's surgeon in the mercantile marine. Slight acquaintances get the impression that he is so calloused to human suffering and human vice as to be completely lacking in sympathy or sentiment. And indeed his uncompromising, severely practical exterior supports the belief. In reality, he is about the squarest and whitest soul I know, and it is only his first-hand experience of life's seamy side among most of the world's races that has developed his iron self-control. I think he could hear or witness any conceivable horror, literally without turning a hair. On the occasion of his last shore leave prior to sailing for the Orient, he followed his usual custom of spending a few days at my bachelor apartments in town. And as his arrival had been too late for me to organize a satisfactory night out, we were passing a quiet evening in my library over nuts and wine. Since it will probably become self-evident later in the story, I may as well confess now to a strongly developed vein of morbid curiosity. Though I am pretty brawny in physique, I find something so uncanny in the actual spectacle of even a comparatively harmless lunatic as to give me feelings of absolute terror. At the same time, maniacs and their more disgusting reactions hold me in a strange fascination. I had been listening avidly to Billy's description of some of his most repulsive cases, when he concluded his recital with one about a dipsomaniac who ended his days chasing gigantic violet wasps with a broom. And this yarn reminded me of some theories on the hallucinations accompanying DTs, which I had once heard in the course of an address by an eminent theosophical lecturer. "Billy," I asked him, without much expectation of tolerance from his pragmatic mind, "do you think there may be anything in the occultist's notion that such monstrosities really exist, and are sometimes rendered visible through the medium of alcohol, drugs, and so forth?" Much to my surprise, he accepted the suggestion without a trace of mockery, and answered with considerable gravity. "You mean what they call breaking down the web that is supposed to divide the physical from the astral? Well, when I was a student, I should have laughed like hell at any such idea. But experientia docet. If you like, I'll tell you about another case that appeared to confirm that hypothesis. At all events, it had some aspects that were beyond ordinary pathological reasoning." "Fire away," I invited eagerly, the morbid streak well to the fore. Billy settled himself deeper in his Chesterfield and helped himself to a handful of nuts, which he began cracking methodically, if absently. "As far as I remember," he began, "we never had a schoolfellow named Chalmers, so I will call my case by that name. You see, the man in question was one of our contemporaries at St. Egbert's, and I've no doubt you'd remember him well enough, but it wouldn't be at all fair to him, or to his admirable wife, to give away their secret. Chalmers was, to all outward appearances, a perfectly normal, healthy boy, good at games to an average degree, passable in his form work, Though not brilliant, I'm not a bit afraid of your recognizing him from my description because he was so very average. He possessed one trait, though, of which I don't suppose anyone suspected him. Beneath his shell of seemingly thoughtless exuberance lay a deep strain of mysticism, all caused, so far as I could make out, by his having recurrent experiences of a singularly evil nightmare dating back to his very earliest recollections. I think I was his only confidant, though why he should have picked on me as a recipient of his confidences I can't think. Fate, I imagine, and anyway it certainly helped me tremendously in understanding his symptoms afterwards. Well, as Chalmers described it, he could not recall any time in his infancy when he was not haunted by an appalling fear, the worse because it was ill-defined, of some horrible entity constantly lurking near him. The usual childish dislike of darkness was, in his case, raised to the nth degree, so that he positively yelled with terror whenever he was left without light for a single instant. Up to the age of nearly 9, he could not be induced to go to bed without a nightlight, and a nurse or someone to share his room. But at about that period, the new adventure of being sent to a day school and having a lot of fresh interests seems to have forced the thing into the back of his consciousness, where it remained for so long that he was finally able to forget it almost completely. He became quite a normal boy, swatted his subjects reasonably, played his cricket and football, and went to bed at night, healthily tired, sleeping soundly without recourse to night lights. When his mind did, very occasionally, turn to the presence that had haunted his cradle and cot, its nature had become so indistinct that, as he told me, he could not have described it even in the vaguest terms. Now, I'm sure you remember the phase we all went through at about 15, when we fell easy prey to advertisers' announcements on the covers of penny shockers, and were always wasting our pocket money on dud water pistols, electric tie pins, etc. Some of us were most attracted by cheap-jack palmists and astrologers, and used to send in perfectly good half-crown postal orders together with time and place of birth in exchange for an astonishing character delineation and outline of your future. Chalmers belonged to this school of thought, and must have spent pounds on being told to beware of a dark woman, and all the usual bilge. He got fed up with it at last, because, as he naively explained, no two forecasts corresponded. Now, personally, I'm inclined to think that, had he left fortune-telling alone for good, he might have grown up into an absolutely fit, sane, and unimaginative human animal, and saved himself the hell of a nasty experience later. But, as fate would have it, a most superior sort of fair came to the town for a few days, and one of the sideshows was a booth tenanted by a self-styled lady psychometrist. I remember, I interrupted. Madame Caramel or Caramella or something. Yeah, name like that, Billy agreed. Anyway, somebody persuaded Chalmers to give her a trial, and he duly paid his $1 and was taken into a dark room where the lady seated herself beside him on a divan and proceeded to hold his hand. He'd always had his fortune told by post before, and this method was a new one to him, with the result that he thought first of all she wanted him to make love to her. Being then about 16 and unversed in the ways of the world, he was trying to decide how he ought to begin, when the lady suddenly began talking at a rapid rate, and squeezing his hand with a great excess of muscular strength. Looking at her sharply, he saw that her eyes were shut, and that her complexion had gone white, while beads of sweat stood out on the forehead. So greatly was he fascinated by his first experience of somebody in an apparently genuine trance that he missed quite a lot of her opening statements. But his ears were sharpened when she began telling him that his was a destiny of abysmal horror, and that his feet would walk forever in the glades of hell, overshadowed by a sin-bred monster of his own begetting. He told me about the whole thing quite unexpectedly, when we were out on a bird's nesting ramble on a half-holiday, and though he could not repeat the episode verbatim, the gist of it was that he had been addicted to the cult of black magic in a former life, and had begotten, or caused to be begotten, some dreadful hybrid, part human, part foul, which looked to him for the continuity of its earthly existence. Life by life, as he himself was reincarnate. Or that his ego had long since dropped the cult and was now concerned only with the processes of natural law did not free him from the responsibility for his creature, and only by resuming his former malpractices at the cost of his own soul could he give this being its just chance of evolving through successive stages of bestiality until a wholly human vehicle could be attained. Well, that sort of thing at the time seemed to me the last word in tripe, apart from its degenerate aspect, and I told Chalmers so, pretty bluntly. He retorted that he would certainly have thought the same, but for the fact that the psychometrist's affirmation had caused the resumption of his childish nightmares, and with greatly enhanced vividness. He was in a highly excitable state, and absolutely shouted down my arguments when he came to describe the thing that overshadowed him. He swore that it was the same apparition that had lurked long ago in his nursery, and described it as mainly human in shape, standing erect on legs, but entirely covered by silver-grey feathers, except for the neck, which was naked and scrawny, like that of a vulture. It loped rather than walked, and constantly tilted its feathered face to this or that side, like a fowl when it is listening. Its eyes were jet black and beady, and filled with a febrile glee whenever they met his own. In spite of my youthful scepticism, I found myself powerfully impressed by Chalmers' recital, and realized that his hallucination must, to him at any rate, be terribly existent. He became most convincing when he alluded to the creature's habit of hopping or fluttering onto his bed and perching with crossed legs upon his chest. Several times, he maintained, he had dropped off to sleep through sheer weariness, awakening to find the monstrosity crouching above him, its restless, glinting orbs flickering rapidly from his head to his feet with an expression of conquering delight, as though it had, after long search, found its appointed resting place. He went back to nightlights after that. Not the old-fashioned wax wicks, but 30-watt electric bulbs. The electric light switch in his bedroom remained depressed during the whole of his sleeping hours, and he craved for human companionship in those nocturnal stretches, though convention precluded the presence of a female nurse. You must understand that Chalmers was then going through a sort of private hell, and would have hated to take his people into his confidence for fear of ridicule. He could not therefore ask his brother to share his room, and must needs fight his own damnable destiny with his own resources. About 20 boys left St. E's at the end of that term, so you can amuse yourself guessing at Chalmers' identity. He was numbered among the 20, and I didn't set eyes on him again for about 2 years, when I happened to bump across him in Oxford. No, he wasn't an undergrad. His parents were both dead, and had left him enough money to treat life as a kind of prolonged cook's tour. That advantage didn't seem to have helped much. He had evidently undergone a tremendous change. In that brief period, all his boyhood and good nature had dropped away from him, and left a miserable, human hulk, unable or unwilling to discuss any ordinary human pleasantries such as theatres, and concerned only with an abysmal introspectiveness. It was close to Carfax I met him, and after listening to his sorrows as long as I thought judicious, I took him into the first licensed restaurant I could think of. It happened to be the George, and bought him a feed, complete with alcoholic extras. It didn't seem to do him much good. Having ascertained that he was temporarily residing at the Crown and Thistle at Abingdon, I ran him home in my car. That was the last I saw of Chalmers for about 12 years, and by the time I next heard of him, both the man and his delusion had pretty well faded away from my memory. It was during one of my visits to the old people at their house near Worcester that our paths crossed again, and it happened in this way. The governor, as you know, still keeps his practice going, and we were discussing one of his invalids at a rather late hour one evening in his study. The housemaid presently announced a lady visitor, whom she had shown into the consulting room, and the pater, who is very easy-going about surgery hours, went straight in to see her. He came back almost at once, however, and told me I was the doctor she wished to see. This surprised me a bit, as apart from giving the old man occasional advice with some difficult case, I had never been concerned in his practice, and was, in fact, very rarely at liberty to go and stay with him. The girl who confronted me was tall, well-formed, her untouched complexion testifying to a country upbringing. She introduced herself, without preamble, as Mrs. Cyril Chalmers, and said how thankful she was that I happened to be on shore leave. She looked intelligent and level-headed, though her face showed lines of worry, and I noticed, it is a doctor's job to notice such things, that she was about to become a mother. Chalmers and his obsession came back to me as soon as she mentioned the name, but I quite naturally supposed that it was about her pregnancy she wished to consult me. This supposition was strengthened when she asked how soon my leave expired, and I told her I still had 3 weeks to go. In that case, she went on, perhaps you wouldn't mind attending to my confinement, but it's really about Cy that I've come to see you. He tells me you know all about the thing which he believes overshadows him. I nodded, and she gave me a look of relief. That helps, she continued, because when I tell you that the thing has mastered him and turned him into a raving lunatic, you'll understand how to approach his case. He's been completely uncontrolled for months now, and the only reason I've been able to keep him at home is because he hasn't actually attacked anyone, at least not murderously. I've had to get rid of all female servants, you understand, and our staff now consists of 2 ex-servicemen, one acting as male nurse and the other as cook general. Of course, I could quite easily get him certified and put in a mental home. only it's sometimes difficult to get a patient out again, even when they are cured. Often, I fear he is incurable. But you will be a better judge of that, and if there is any treatment available for such a case, I'd like it done at home. Cy takes the same view, but doesn't want to be attended by anyone but yourself. He has great faith in you." "Oh," I interrupted, "he has lucid intervals, then?" But she shook her head vigorously. "No," came her flat denial. "He is constantly possessed. He keeps hopping and sidling about like some horrible crow, and even in his sleep he looks only half human." "Then how was he able to direct you to me?" I naturally inquired, and received the astonishing reply. "His body is mad, but his mind is sane." "What the devil do you mean?" I asked sharply, for this crazy statement sounded suspiciously like a leg pull. She answered in a perfectly calm voice, and I began to admire her level-headedness, though I was badly puzzled. "You'll understand when you see him, Doctor. The fact is, he doesn't realize what has happened. All the time he is strutting and flapping about the place. He can talk and answer questions in his own perfectly normal voice, but he doesn't seem to know that his vocal cords are uttering the words. He speaks as though he were in some other part of the room, watching the antics of his own body. It is quite evident after a few moments' conversation that he has some extraordinary sense of standing outside himself and looking on. He thinks his body is the creation that haunts him." I kept silent a few minutes while I tried to take this in. It was a new kind of delusion in my experience. "Well," I suggested at length, "you better tell me how the whole business started." And it was in giving the account of this that her admirable poise did, for a short time, desert her. I found ample excuse, though, when I'd heard the facts. The ordeal that poor girl had gone through would have driven 90% of women straight off their heads. Apparently, she and Chalmers had met at a dance about 2 years before, and fallen in love, more or less at first sight. As she had plenty of money, there was no reason for a long engagement. Though Chalmers was sensible enough to tell his fiancée about his secret fear and the words of the fortune-teller before the wedding, he assured her there was no hereditary insanity in his family, and that his delusion, if delusion it was, could hurt nobody but himself, adducing the fact that no other person had ever been able to see his spectre, even though it presented itself to his own perceptions in crowded places. The girl was pleased at this display of his confidence, which made her all the more eager to marry him, as she believed her companionship would be a help when he thought the apparition was nearby. The ceremony was therefore hastened on, and for several months it did seem that the acquisition of a wife had improved Chalmers' spirits. He began to go about much more than he had done for years, taking his wife on a constant round of theatres, dances, and bridge parties. He even voluntarily alluded to his obsession, and she realized that his choice of such a gay life was prompted by his desire for distraction from it. The only inconvenience she suffered was having to get used to sleeping with the light on. Well, they kept up a protracted honeymoon for a considerable time, travelling a lot and staying at all the most expensive hotels. The girl, a country parson's daughter, had never lived so lavishly before, and she enjoyed every bit of it. At last, however, she suggested that they ought to take a house somewhere and settle down for a bit, if only to return the hospitality they had been receiving from Chalmers' wealthy acquaintances. And the place they picked was an old Victorian mansion in a Sussex village not too far from town. The furnishers and decorators had it ready for them in a few weeks, and they celebrated their entrance into country life by throwing a big house party to which a number of bright young people were invited. Everything seems to have gone with a swing from start to finish, the bright young people inventing their own amusements from day to day, and thus saving host and hostess a lot of organising. Mrs. Chalmers, however, noticed from the outset that her husband's recent gaiety was on the decline. He entered into various round games and skylarks when he was literally cornered by his guests. But, as often as opportunity offered, he would slip out unobserved and wander off into the country for hours on end, frequently not returning till the small hours of the morning. He began to suffer badly from insomnia, but turned down all suggestions that he should try sleeping draughts. Mrs. Chalmers was constantly waking up in the night to find him sitting in a chair reading, and her woman's instinct finally brought her to the realization that he was frightened to sleep. One morning, when he came home after 3 and found her lying awake, she took him to task about it. He was more fidgety and distrait than ever, and his eyes had a wild expression, like those of something hunted. "Really, my dearest," she began, "you were sweet to tell me all about your trouble when we were engaged. What have I done to lose your confidence now? I could see for myself that whatever your delusion, you weren't mad, and that was why I never hesitated to marry you. But if you don't get a doctor to give you a sleeping mixture, you'll go mad. What is there about this place that's upsetting you? You were all right until we came here." Chalmers, it seems, suddenly broke down, burst into tears, and went off into a long, disjointed account of having found the monster's home. "I felt certain I recognized this place when I first saw it," he concluded, "and I hadn't been in it many hours before I began to get flashes of having lived here before. Not in this life, but centuries ago. I remembered vaguely on the second evening of our residence some outre event having taken place in these very grounds, though the house wasn't there then. I think it happened in some kind of marquee bearing heraldic signs. There was much consternation among a group of priests, and something was put to death and buried in a field about a mile away. I recall being forced to march in the procession to the burial ground, and after that, it's all hopelessly confused, but I think I was burnt at the stake." He shivered and threw himself face down across the bed, while his anxious wife soothingly stroked his hair. "I found the field that same night," he continued brokenly, "and the thing rose up out of the ground to meet me. It's got a hypnotic hold on me and forces me to go, night after night, to commune with it. And soon as it appears, I fall into a kind of stupor and can see nothing clearly, though I have a dreadful remembrance after of having stood for hours on end in a rustling, feathery embrace. I don't know what the thing does to me, but I am falling more and more into its spell, and I have no volition to resist." He sobbed again convulsively, and then muttered in scarcely audible tones, "In a way, I'm even beginning to like it." At first I felt that it was angry with me for not giving it a beastly hybrid vehicle for the accomplishment of its desires. Now it seems content with our loathsome communions. You can well picture poor Mrs. Chalmers' state of mind when she heard this confession. As she saw it, her husband was now definitely suffering from a serious dementia, but she realized how impossible it would be to get his consent to medical advice, and how futile it was to argue with him. She uttered no word of criticism, but quietly and firmly made up her mind to follow him to his next assignation and see for herself what he did. Their house party was now almost broken up, and she had no great difficulty in slipping out of a side door that evening, dressed in a dark, inconspicuous costume, and following Chalmers along a thickly hedged lane to a 5-barred gate over which he proceeded to climb. He had marched all the way like a sleepwalker, without once turning his head, and she now contrived to follow him into the field, where she concealed herself in the moon shadow of a broad and leafy elm. She saw Chalmers march mechanically on, and halt in the middle of the meadow, where he stood with outstretched arms as though awaiting the embrace of some invisible being. For some 10 minutes he remained thus unmoving. Then all at once he seemed to divine her presence, though how he could have seen her in the shadow at such a distance, and with his back towards her, she could not fathom. She only knew that he had turned about and was dashing with unbelievable speed straight for her hiding place. She stood, rooted there, utterly paralyzed with terror, for instead of the square-shouldered, nimble sprint she had so often admired on the tennis courts, he was coming in a series of fluttering, sidelong hops, instinct with the vigorous intensity of a ravening vulture. Within what seemed a second of time, he was upon her, and seizing her in a grip of abnormal strength, had thrown her to the ground. So with one sinewy hand on her throat, he held her pinned, while the other, fingers crooked like talons, ripped and tore at her clothing. Her whirling senses shrieked to her that this was not her husband suddenly demented, but an entirely alien presence into which he had been transformed. Her struggles and attempts to cry out were rendered futile in that merciless grip, and she could only lie supine, with eyes fast shut, to keep out the terror of the metamorphosed face, while in her nostrils clung a farmyard reek, and weird croakings and twitterings assailed her ears. Then her senses left her completely. When she came to, she was still lying in a bed of long, dewy grass in the shadow of the elm, her clothes torn to shreds, and her body bruised from head to foot. Of Chalmers there was no sign. Fortunately, a long silk opera cloak she had been wearing had fallen from her at the first onslaught and escaped damage. She was able to conceal the remnants of her costume beneath it, and to reach the house without exciting comment. Now I think she proved herself a very courageous gentlewoman when she made her way to their bedroom by the back stairs without seeking the aid of guests or servants. On trying the door, she found it locked, but at the rattle of the handle, her husband's voice, now absolutely normal, came from within. "You can't come in, dear," he said earnestly. "The thing has come back with me, and it won't leave." "Nonsense," she replied with firmness. "I must come. Don't you know you've hardly left a rag of clothes on me?" "I've what?" he shouted incredulously. "What do you mean? I haven't even seen you since tea." The apparent sanity of his tone helped her courage. Chalmers must have been quite unconscious of his actions in the field. "I must come in," she repeated. "Never mind what you've got in there with you. I must help you fight it." She heard the lock click and a scamper of footsteps crossing the floor. She pushed the door open, slammed it behind her, and stood leaning back against it, her frightened gaze resting on the astounding spectacle before her. Attired in purple pyjamas, and holding in his mouth a wriggling garden worm, Chalmers was hanging by both hands and one bare foot from the bed rail in the attitude of a parrot that clings inverted to the top of its cage. "You see," he remarked courteously, the worm dropping to the floor as his lips opened, "the beastly thing's got in here now, and pinched a suit of me pyjamas." He dropped to the floor, twisting in agile fashion to alight upon his feet, and hopped upon the windowsill, where he perched with his head askew, and went on conversationally. "Now that you've seen it with your own eyes, I need evade the subject no longer. Here it is, even contriving to look something like me, and here it undoubtedly means to stay, unless we can think of some way to get rid of it. 2 heads better than 1, eh, dear?" He stopped for a moment, scratched the back of his ear with one big toe, and continued. "I wouldn't mind so much if the brute would keep still sometimes, but it won't. It seems imbued with an eternal energy, and keeps hopping about, as you can see." As he spoke, he sprang from the sill to the top of a big walnut wardrobe, and perched there. Mrs. Chalmers' face became more composed as an idea presented itself. "Its movements are so quick," she remarked, "that they distract my attention from you. Would you mind telling me where you were standing, for instance, when it made the last move?" Chalmers' voice sounded sulky and irritable as he answered her. "You little idiot, I wasn't standing. I've been sitting here on the bed ever since you came in." But the voice came from the grotesque figure on the wardrobe. "Well, that is as much as I need to tell you about the origin of Chalmers' dementia," said Billy, mechanically shelling another nut. Chalmers refused to occupy the same bedroom with his wife because, as he explained, he could not get rid of his uncanny visitant, and it was not proper that she should robe and disrobe in its presence, an opinion for which the poor lady was devoutly thankful. We put her up for the night, and the next day I travelled with her to her Sussex home to interview the patient. He, or rather his body, was in a recalcitrant state when I was shown in. The nurse, a big brawny fellow, told me that it had been the devil's own job to prevent his escaping that morning when he heard that his wife was still away. Even primed with Mrs. Chalmers' account of her husband's delusion, I will confess that it gave me an uncanny feeling to see the fellow strutting and pirouetting obscenely, while his voice said in perfectly natural accents, "Glad you could come, Cole, but take no notice of that idiot. I wasn't trying to escape. It was the blasted hybrid, and if they let it, there'll be hell popping. Not a woman in the village will be safe, from what I can guess of its instincts." I noticed that Chalmers' face was heavily coated with cream and talcum powder, so that he looked unpleasantly like a sex pervert. "Why do you... I began, and then hastily remembered his delusion. Why does your hybrid put that stuff on its face? He hopped several times from floor to bed and back again before replying. It imitates me, he said. In every little thing I do. It uses my safety razor, only it has to remove not hair but feathers. I suppose it puts the cream and talcum on to hide the quills. I shivered a bit, and soon made a pretext to leave him. Mrs. Chalmers, I told his wife as soon as we were out of earshot, there is no need to get your husband certified, but I absolutely insist upon his leaving this house until your confinement is over. Now I've a friend, a Dr. Gunther, who keeps a private nursing home not many miles from here. We shall have to drug Cyril and take him there in a closed car. Gunther will look after him until you're on your feet again, and then you can bring him back here, if you still wish to. To my relief, she fell in with the proposal, and that afternoon the plan was put into effect. For once, Chalmers seemed to realize that he was in some way identified with his hybrid, for he shouted at me to get the hell out of it for a treacherous hound while I was adjusting the chloroform pad. I stayed on at the house to keep an eye on the wife until her time came, and then phoned Gunther, asking him to come over as assistant. You see, I had found out that Mrs. Chalmers' pregnancy dated from the night of his metamorphosis, and had decided to administer an anesthetic. It would be as well, I thought, if she saw nothing. Well, the event finally took place, and my watch told me the hour was 2 a.m. We removed the offspring to an adjoining room, where it lived only for a few hours. Confidentially, we made no very serious effort to save its life, and it was just as we had finally ascertained that the pulse had really stopped that a phone call came in from Gunther's matron to say that Chalmers had suddenly recovered his sanity. One of his first acts had been to wipe the powder from his face with a handkerchief, and he had then called an attendant, to whom he expressed his satisfaction that the hybrid had all at once dissolved into thin air, leaving him with a greater sense of freedom and well-being than he had known for months. As it happened, Gunther was then washing his hands, and it was I who took the call. Something prompted me to inquire the hour at which Chalmers had been restored, and the matron replied that, to the best of her knowledge, it was about 2 a.m. Now, you can call me imaginative if you like, old man, but I believe that there was something from the other side attached to Chalmers, and that it did actually steal his body for a period of time. When the offspring was born, its needed vehicle was to hand, and into it the non-human strain passed from Chalmers through the medium of his wife. Evidently it could not get back when the infant body died, and I think that, with Chalmers' debt of suffering paid in full, Providence may have mercifully allowed the hybrid soul to die too. I shall never forget the venom with which its newborn eyes looked at me, while I withheld the nourishment it needed. Billy stopped and took a sip of port, but my morbid streak was not yet satisfied. "But what was the offspring like?" I demanded. Billy shot me an amused glance. "Thank God it was passably human in shape," he responded. "But we had to pluck it before the undertakers came." Today's story was Hybrid by L.A.Lewis. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, sweet dreams.